Furnishings for this program provided by Van Tassel's Fireside Furniture and Clock Gallery, 5000 Kilgore, Muncie, Indiana.
Guests on today's program include a top educator and a former president of the United States. Dr. Ann King Reynolds, former Ball State University professor of biology, now chancellor of the nation's largest system of four-year and graduate-level higher education institutions, the California State University, received an honorary Doctor of Science degree at Ball State commencement ceremonies recently. She talked with us about problems facing higher education and student demonstrations against apartheid.
Dr. Reynolds, what do you see as the pluses and minuses for higher education in the near future?
There are a lot of pluses if one wants them to be pluses. For us in California, and we view it as a plus, is the growing minority population with the special challenges and yet the cultural enrichment that presents. In California, and of course this is a bit of a harbinger for the rest of the nation, nearly 1/4 of all K through 12 students now are Hispanic. They have traditionally not gone on in higher education. We really feel that it is critical. We're at a critical point where we must change that and make higher education accessible for that group as well. Another one of the very exciting positive things is just as Ball State emerged from being a normal school, an institution concentrating on teacher education, once again the nation needs teachers in a lot of locations. Our teaching enrollments have dropped off, so we're faced once again with being very excited about getting young people back into teaching once more.
You have a shortage of teachers in California?
We estimate that by 1990 we'll need over 100,000 new teachers in the state of California.
How would you motivate minorities to enter higher education?
We have several programs. One is our Step to College program, which Dr. Harry Handler of the Los Angeles Unified School District and I initiated in the Los Angeles Basin area 2 years ago, in which involves high schools with primary or very heavily minority enrollments. The guidance counselors select young people that look promising, and we enable them to come to a college campus and take a single course, which shows them that they can be successful. Many of them do not realize they can do college work and do it well. Other things are summer bridge programs where we have interested, vigorous young people, young faculty, meeting with prospective college students. Then efforts of having our people, our counselors out in the public schools, even now at the level of the junior highs, to interest students in what college could give to them and bring to them.
Those are some of the pluses. How about minuses?
Well, the total reliance, really, of most of higher education on state funding. Our support now in California is much improved. We have a Governor Deukmejian whose top priority has been education since coming into office 2.5 years ago. And the state's revenues are better. But it's very, very hard on a great university, and Ball State is a great university, when state revenues aren't good and there's a sudden drop in funding. Higher education institutions need constant, steady funding that is based on their real needs. And it's been a great hardship nationwide to have great universities have sudden cuts in funding because of state financial exigencies.
This is what's going to happen Dr. Clark Kerr, President Emeritus of the University of California, at the March Governors Conference, mentioned the fact that universities and colleges are going to be more reliant on states for their dollars. What kind of a difference do you think? What are we talking about in percentage? You talked about a drop in funding.
Well, it just depends. It depends on the state, the financial status of the state, the number of young people going on to higher education, and probably, basically, if I can be so bold, the sentiments of the governor's mother. Mothers have a lot of influence on how people feel about education. And so if state officials have a strong commitment to higher education, then higher education gets better support. And of course, equally important is support for K through 12, because unless the public schools are well supported, students are not prepared to take advantage of either going on after high school into careers and jobs or going on to college.
There's a great deal of competition for state dollars. And there is always a preeminent university within a state that is favored. And other emerging universities and colleges who have emerged from teachers' colleges into universities compete for these dollars. How do they compete against the older established university?
Well, that's one of the virtues of the California Master Plan for Higher Education, which was implemented 25 years ago. We have 3 tiers of public higher education. The University of California system, which are the 9 University of California institutions, including the emphasis on the doctorate, law schools, and medical schools. Then the system I'm involved with, the California State University system, which is the largest baccalaureate granting system in the United States. We have 316,000 students now, and master's degrees. And then the community college tier. By doing that, those of us who are centrally involved with these institutions work with the governor and the legislature on our funding needs, the various programs facing them, so that the legislature and the governor deal with only 3 entities rather than the literally dozens of institutions that we represent.
And this is working satisfactorily?
We believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a fair arrangement for the higher education dollars.
A new survey indicates that 6 in every 10 U.S. colleges and universities are reviewing the quality of their curriculum. What changes are needed to meet the needs of the student?
Well, there was a commission appointed by the National Institute of Education that brought its report in nearly about 8 months ago. It was, the commission was appointed by then Director Manuel Hustis, and the commission was chaired by Dr. Kenneth Mortimer. Since that time, that report has been reviewed nationwide. There was a meeting in New England, one in Louisiana, and then just a week ago, we, the California State University, hosted a meeting on this issue for the 20 western states to do just that, discuss the status of the baccalaureate degree, the problems that we face in doing it, how to make sure it's a first-rate quality degree, what level of general education, humanities, liberal arts courses should be taught. From the tenor of that meeting and the anxiety of people, the soul searching, I think it's very clear that there are changes afoot in higher education. Many of us have gone through a very hard look at our general education or liberal arts underpinning. We just at our Board of Trustees meeting, which was day before yesterday, put forth some very stringent tightening up and changes in our teacher education curriculum to make it a more demanding, more rigorous procedure that we believe will produce teachers that are better prepared to be in the classroom. There are a lot of these kinds of efforts afoot.
Pressure is being brought to bear by protesting students and faculty on some universities to divest themselves of economic interest in companies doing business with the Republic of South Africa because of its apartheid policies. How should universities deal with the protest and the protesters?
If you're asking personal philosophy, if the protesters are your own students and they have an honest intellectual issue, I believe you should embrace them and love them to death, because students are wonderful and they are questioning and they are concerned. If the students are not students, they are interested standers-by, and they are damaging property or putting other innocent individuals or themselves at risk of bodily harm, then I think one has to be much more stringent in controlling such situations. And I think that's the policy we've adhered to and the policy that the University of California has adhered to. The South African issue, I believe, is an appropriate one for students to be concerned about. It's evoked a great deal of discussion on campuses. We're hoping that what it has caused is for students to become greatly involved in soul searching on this issue, along with interested faculty. We, back in 1978 in the California State University, our Board of Trustees urged that all discretionary funds that were in investment accounts be in accord with humanitarian principles. They've come to become called the Sullivan principles. The issue now facing the University of California is a more complicated one because they have greater numbers of discretionary and retirement accounts involved with such companies. The reason it's a difficult one, though, there are many American companies that have tried very hard to help all classes, all ethnic people in South Africa with their policies there. And that's why it's a difficult intellectual issue and worthy of our best consideration.
Corporations are often generous donors with grants, equipment, and funds. Do you see these projects being jeopardized by activists insisting that universities divest themselves of that stock in South Africa?
I think corporations have been amazingly tolerant sometimes of some of the escapades of people, in that people that manage corporations generally have college-age youngsters themselves, and probably have gone through some fairly sharp questioning on corporate policy themselves as well. In addition, we and all of higher education work very closely with corporations now on trying to graduate well-prepared engineers, well-prepared MBAs, or well-prepared accountants, or people in the humanities are having increasing job opportunities with industry. So I do not see that issue being jeopardized. My perception is that corporations are just as concerned, most of them, about good, appropriate humanitarian policies. I think the nation has, I think that has evolved in the last 20 years, and I like to think that higher education institutions and our students help bring that about.
In a sense, activists are urging a boycott of companies, or actually, in a sense, a boycott of companies doing business in South Africa. Should that extend to our allowing South African students to enter our educational system?
Well, many our educational systems for years have had student exchange programs, international programs, and I think they have been magnificent. It is wonderful when someone goes to mainland China and finds someone there in an institution, who's been there for 40 years, who was trained in the United States. I remember once a good friend, a biologist, cabled me or wrote to me about the score of the Ohio State-Michigan game from China, and I dutifully cabled it back. And he had encountered a man, this was shortly after China opened up, and he had encountered a Chinese professor that nobody had heard of since the 30s who'd gone to Michigan, and he'd encountered one that nobody had heard of since the 30s that had gone to Ohio State, and they both remembered the Ohio State-Michigan football game from 40 years ago and wanted to know what was happening. Probably more than anything else, our educational efforts with international students have truly promoted international understanding. Sometimes the payoff isn't evident for half a century, but it is there, and we should keep doing it.
So we should allow them to enter our educational system.
Very much so.
Just one final question on this. How intense do you see campus activism becoming during the latter part of the 1980s?
It's hard to know. We're working on some projects now to involve students in internships of a social work nature, to work with the homeless, to work with foster children, to work with truant children, children with the potential of dropping out, and even bag people, you know, the bag people that one sees in large cities. One of the reasons for being concerned about this is that with all of the emphasis on getting jobs and the yuppie generation, one hates to think that the prime emphasis of every one of our college graduates is the best paying job, the best looking condo, and the most expensive foreign-made car. I, for one, just don't think that's true of all our students. And so efforts towards social involvement, concern for fellow man, I welcome in the student body. I realize it's not always harmonious, but I think the empathy, the warmth of our young toward their fellow man and woman should be welcomed, and I think we should foster it more.
Former President Gerald Ford, a recent speaker on the Ball State campus, had some interesting comments on government, politics, and the international situation during a scheduled news conference.
President Ford.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I have no further prepared remarks. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. President, you mentioned out there in your speech not necessarily cutting defense spending, but spreading it out. How would that help cut the deficit?
Well, if you stretch out the defense program from 5 to 6 years, in effect stretching out $1.7 trillion over 72 months rather than 60 months, you can have significant cash flow benefits every year, and that will have a corresponding cash flow benefit as far as the deficits are concerned. I would say that it would save in cash flow at least $15 to $25 billion, depending on just how you implemented it. But it would be a significant contribution to debt reduction.
How important is debt reduction?
Well, I happen to believe that reduction of our deficits is the only way we can guarantee that we'll have continued prosperity for the next 5 years. If we all pull together and do our share, we can absolutely maintain a healthy economy for the next 5 years.
Are you Mr. President?
Yes.
Mr. President, today the MX missile received final congressional approval, and tomorrow Dr. Helen Caldicott, the founder of Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, will speak on the same campus. What would you say to her about today's passage?
Well, I haven't heard her remarks, so I am not qualified to answer what she'll say categorically. I can say this. As one who actually negotiated with Mr. Brezhnev to reduce nuclear weapons and who was able to achieve a reduction in strategic weapons in such negotiations, my track record is pretty good in getting results, not talking about it. I would say that in order to have the United States achieve a reduction of nuclear weapons in negotiations, they ought to go to the bargaining table with all of our weapon system available for negotiation, including the MX. I strongly feel the MX vote was the right one. Substantively, in order to maintain equivalence with the Soviet Union, and psychologically and from a negotiating position, absolutely essential.
Mr.
Yes.
President, you mentioned social programs that have been on the books for quite some time and mentioned their essentiality. Could you elaborate a little longer on what programs might be deferred?
Well, I gave 2 examples in response to a question, and there are others that I'm sure the Congress will take a look at. But the 2 I gave are very important. They involve probably anywhere from $6 to $10 billion annually. Yes.
General revenue sharing is one of the programs
Yes,
you mentioned.
absolutely.
Cities and counties have become quite dependent on general revenue sharing to meet operating expenses, especially in the state where we have a frozen tax levy. What options do they have to make up for that revenue that they would lose?
Well, the amount of actual cash that a community or governmental unit gets out of revenue sharing is really not a significant part of their overall budget. And in the current fiscal crisis that the federal government has, which I happen to think is worse than any individual city or any individual state, first things have to come first. We have to get Uncle Sam's fiscal picture in order if we're going to have a strong nation. And in the process, everybody who's involved in getting money from the federal government will have to share some of the belt tightening.
Yes. Along the same lines, the farmers right now are upset about the financial crisis they're going to have. 1986 being an election year, and I believe 23 Republican senators are up for re-election. What effect is the farm vote going to have, the cuts in the farm budget going to have on that vote next year and control of the Senate?
Well, I have great sympathy for the American farmers who bought too much land at too high a price when prices paid for their commodities were high. And I feel very saddened by their economic plight today when land prices are down, when market prices are down, and they overextended themselves. The program of the federal government today is to try and ease this financial crisis by extending the term of their loans, by giving them reduced interest rates and refinancing their loans that they made when things were going good. Now, I don't believe we can continue farm price support programs that price our commodities out of the world market. Right today, because of our price support programs, Argentina, Australia, other countries are undercutting us in the foreign markets, and our sales abroad as a result are suffering. We've got to be competitive. We're the most efficient agricultural country in the world. And for us, by artificial price supports, cutting ourselves out of those markets doesn't make sense.
Mr. President.
Yes.
You complained about the length and the cost of the presidential campaign. Any thoughts from you on the way in which network television and the major newspapers and wire services have covered the substantive issues of the campaign, especially in the Reagan environment?
Oh, I think as a whole, the news media, both the written and the electronic press, did a better than average job. On the other hand, I think they picked up a lot of trivia, which really wasn't very substantive as to the views of either Mondale or Reagan. I wish the networks particularly, but local stations I guess, would spend more time on substance rather than a 15 or 30-second trivia answer to some question. I know how valuable your time is on the tube and all this and that, but you would do a great service to the American people if you would take more time and give more substance instead of just some trivia that you pick up from here or there. Yes, yes.
What are your feelings about the drug and alcohol abuse in this country?
What do I think about drug and alcohol abuse? Well, I think we've got to maximize our effort to do something about it. My wife is the chairman of the board of the Betty Ford Center on Alcoholism and Chemical Dependency, so I know something about how the best way to treat those problems. But we don't have enough good treatment centers around the country to help people who unfortunately have had that difficulty. On the other hand, we ought to do more of education among young people to point out the evils of either alcoholism or drug addiction. So if you try to help those who unfortunately are affected, and you try to educate those who have not yet been affected, I think that's the proper way.
Mr. President, you highlighted some of the changes you'd like to see in the presidential nominating process. Do you think those will become reality?
Well, I think there's a movement afoot. As a matter of fact, in my Ford library at the University of Michigan, we're having a 2.5-day conference on how to improve the election or nomination process. And there's another group under former Congressman Mel Laird and former Democratic National Chairman Bob Strauss at Georgetown University, which is going to do much the same thing. Maybe we can get some momentum going. Maybe we can get some momentum going to bring about necessary legislation. Yes?
Did you say that 40 million drop in the deficit would reduce interest rates 1.5%?
1.5% across the board. Yes, sir.
Well, in light of what you were saying about the need to reduce the deficit, why do you still think that MX missiles, which some people say will be obsolete by the time it gets installed, how can you defend putting MX missiles in against the need to reduce?
Well, for two very good reasons. The first reason being that substantively we need it. As a matter of fact, I initiated in my administration the research and development of the MX missile. Mr. Carter continued it, and under the Scowcroft Commission, we now have the present deployment procedure. We initiated the MX because the Soviet Union, beginning in the late 70s, undertook a massive program to increase the throw weight and to improve the accuracy of their land-based ballistic missiles. And they now have achieved that capability with a new generation of missiles. And for us to retain equivalence, not superiority, equivalence, we need the MX. And secondly, having negotiated with Mr. Brezhnev, the Congress, when I negotiated with him, didn't take any weapon systems away from me. So when I went over to negotiate, we had the opportunity to negotiate any and all weapons that we had available. And the net result was, because I had no hampering by the Congress, we were able to get Mr. Brezhnev to reduce his launchers by about 350. And we only had to reduce ours by about 100. So by having flexibility as a negotiator, I was able to get significant progress. If you take away the MX, Mr. Kampelman and Mr. Glittman and Senator Tower are going to be handicapped in trying to get some responsible reduction.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Do you think that our government should interfere with Nicaragua?
Well, I think we have an obligation to help the legitimate Nicaraguans, anti-Sandinistas, who want to restore democracy in their country. The current government in Nicaragua is not a democratic government. It's in effect a dictatorship. And there are bona fide Nicaraguans, anti-Sandinistas, who want to restore a democratic society in Nicaragua. I don't see any harm in Americans or our government helping those legitimately. I wouldn't do it covertly, because that's always criticized, but I would permit it to be done overtly. One more, and then we have to go. Somebody back there, yeah.
In your autobiography, you refer to Jimmy Carter as having an obsession with civil rights. Do you think this is detrimental to our foreign affairs after he left office in any way?
Well, I think you have to have a reasonable point of view. I'm very proud of my administration's record on civil rights, and I'm proud of the voting record I had in the Congress on civil rights. But I think you've got to have a reasonable balance. And in some respects, I think the Carter administration went overboard. One more.
Mr. President.
Yeah.
Why do you think the Star Wars defense system will help or hinder U.S., Russian, Soviet?
Well, I personally believe we ought to maximize our research and development, primarily research on Star Wars. We're so a long, long ways away from developing any hardware. This is extremely far-reaching scientific research. We're at least 3 or 4 years away from developing any significant hardware. Let's get the research done and then make a decision as to whether we want to proceed with the actual manufacture of and deployment of hardware. Thank you all. It's nice to see you. It's great to be here at Ball State. Thank you.
Furnishings for this program provided by Van Tassel's Fireside Furniture and Clock Gallery, 5000 Kilgore, Muncie, Indiana.